Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, have you ever seen a mandala?
I have, just browsing what sort of art Buddhists produce. They're often beautiful, and I can usually see an interesting mathematical aspect. I can get lost trying to reverse engineer those numbers. I've learned some of their basic meanings and functions, but I'm certain there's much more to them than what I can see.
They are quite fascinating. Many think that they are simply meditation aids that people look at to help visualize Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. However, that's not the whole story. They're representations of the mind of the Buddha himself, and the representations of reality itself as it truly is.
Which means that the mind of the Buddha is no different from reality as it truly is.
Yes, exactly. Because the Buddha perceives things exactly as they are, in their truest form, the landscape of his mind is indistinct from the Dharma, from things as they are, and from suchness itself.
Fascinating. It's like a mirror or a window into enlightenment.
Indeed, and so much more so are the three-dimensional mandalas, spots in this world where delusion and ignorance have been washed away and eliminated.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing Shingon Buddhist sacred spaces. What are some characteristics of Shingon Buddhist sacred spaces? How do they differ from other Buddhist sacred spaces? How are Shingon sacred spaces influenced by texts and doctrines? We hope you enjoy. But before we get into Buddhism, let's take a broad look at the subject. What are sacred spaces?
As with the definitions of words like religion, philosophy, and doctrine, defining sacred spaces in a very specific way is incredibly hard. We usually fall back on the good old you know it when you see it definition on this show, but there are some specific considerations that we must look at when defining sacred spaces in particular. Some definitions focus on human interaction and engagement, and others center on the place itself. One model is that a place's sacredness is derived from the collective input and belief of large numbers of people. This is intuitive to us. People decide that a space is special and separate from the rest of the environment because something important happened there, because they claim it has some special divine characteristic, or a combination of both. This collective claim gets passed down generation to generation, and the community respects and venerates the place in question. Every day, local churches and temples are a great example of this. Believers observe specific rules and norms in their particular churches and temples according to the mandate of their religion. They dress in a particular way, they speak in a particular manner, they act a particular way, they may visit the space at particular days or times, and they believe that the space has a relationship to the divine that the rest of the everyday environment lacks. The less intuitive model that centers on people is one of exclusivity. In opposition to the previous model, this one understands sacredness as deriving from the fact that the everyday public cannot be there lest the space become polluted with mundanity and its secrets become widely known. This is the Wizard of Oz model. The impact requires that nobody can see behind the curtain, allowing their imagination to run wild. Only those who are specially or specifically initiated, who are members of a particular group, or who are otherwise permitted can traverse there. Shinto shrines are a perfect example of this. These temples enshrine a kami or god, and this god has a body, known as a Go-Shintai. This is often an object, such as a mirror. These Go-Shintai are often kept hidden from public view. This concealment makes them sacred and divine because not just anybody can look at them, lest the sacred quality be cheapened, and we start to think, oh, that's just an old mirror. The first model of sacredness centered on the space itself regards the place's sacred quality as its relationship to power of any and all kinds. For example, the White House is a sacred space in the quote-unquote religion of American patriotism and nationalism because it's the seat of the person who has the final say on the highest level of law in the country. It represents political, social, and ideological authority, and it is the metaphorical center of the country's capital. It also represents the whiteness of American history and the erasure of other histories. For another example, the Vatican is the highest authority in Catholicism, and so St. Peter's Square is considered sacred due to the power and influence of the institution it houses. A location's history is extremely important in this conception of sacred spaces. Sometimes a place becomes sacred simply because something important happened there in the past. The final model of spatial sacredness is related to a question of if something is man-made versus natural. Sacred spaces are often constructed, usually in a way that is unique and different compared to other spaces, but they can also be entirely untouched by humanity. For example, Mount Fuji has a great deal of religious, social, literary, and artistic sacredness in Japanese culture and history, as a natural landmark. These are just a few of the different models from which we can examine sacred spaces and what makes them sacred, but there are many more. Docs, how do you understand sacred spaces?
In earlier episodes, I've answered questions like these by referring to the verbs around the concept, and my answer is essentially the same here. I classify sacred spaces based on how my behavior is expected to change while I'm there. I try to be more respectful in places I understand as sacred. I use more formal or polite language. I try not to cuss. I may wear more formal clothes for these visits. While I'm in a sacred space, I make extra effort to follow the expected rules, and I'll keep that respectful tone when discussing such places, even if I'm not there.
That's very fascinating. The sacred quality of a place is reflected in the changes from our regular daily behavior that we must make when we're in them or whenever we're talking about them. In sum, the sacredness of a place is socially constructed, whether inclusively or exclusively or a mixture of both. This construction is reinforced by the collective actively participating in its construction, and so on and so forth in a cycle. In that way, sacred spaces are often the intersection of opposing ends of a spectrum, such as text and ritual, the animate and the inanimate, the mundane and the divine, the past and the present, etc. So keep this in mind as we discuss Buddhist sacred spaces.
With that background covered, let's get into Buddhism specifically. What are some characteristics of Shingon and other Buddhist sacred spaces?
So obviously I'm very excited about this question because Shingon Buddhist sacred spaces and Buddhist sacred spaces in general are perhaps my biggest research interest. I love Shingon Buddhist art, architecture, and history, so this is an opportunity for me to talk about something I'm personally very into. The first Buddhist sacred spaces in history were stupas. Stupas are temples erected to house the remains of somebody important who has died. People come to stupas to pay respects, to worship, or to do specific rituals concerning those remains. After the death of the Buddha, which we cover in our reading and discussion of the Parinirvana Sutra, the link will be in the show notes, after the Buddha's remains were distributed to different places, stupas were erected over them. And in Buddhism, the tradition of erecting stupas over the remains of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva has continued. Sometimes stupas can be tall vertical buildings, and sometimes they're dome-like structures. Sometimes one is able to go inside and view the remains, and other times the remains are concealed, either in a container or maybe even buried underground. As Buddhism moved into China, Korea, and Japan, pagodas began to be constructed as the East Asian adaptations of stupas. In cases where there are no remains of a Buddha, a Bodhisattva, or an important monk to be housed, icons of that figure can stand in. These could be painted or drawn images, statues, or carved reliefs, or symbolic or metaphorical representations. There are countless examples of all three, but of particular note are the symbolic or metaphorical representations. We've discussed how the Dharma, the sutras, and sermons given by the Buddha have all come to be regarded as his remains in this world, indistinct from his ashes, especially in the Mahayana. Thus, many stupas and temples have been erected over copies of sutras, and the text itself is regarded as being the Buddha himself, or at least equivalent to his physical remains. Statues and images are interesting as well. In sacred spaces that erect statues or present carved, painted, or drawn images of Buddhas or Bodhisattvas, those images serve a specific function. They can assist in visualization, they can represent the actual presence of the Buddha or Bodhisattva they depict in the room that they are in, and they can serve as performers or participants in the rituals that take place in that sacred space around them. What fascinates me so much about Shingon Buddhist sacred spaces is that they hit all of the points I've mentioned. They have inclusion and exclusion, they have authority, and they can be constructed and natural. They often have physical remains, and they also sometimes have images, which assist in visualization, represent the actual presence of the deity they depict, and these deities are then also active performers and participants in the rituals that take place in their environs. So let's lay it out. Shingon sacred spaces typically have two mandalas, the Diamond Realm Mandala and the Womb Realm Mandala, known in Japanese as the Kōkai Mandala and the Taizokai Mandala, respectively. These are hung on walls facing each other. The Diamond Realm Mandala is hung on the west wall facing east, and the Womb Realm Mandala is hung on the east wall facing west. For more on the significance and usage of these mandalas, check out the Research Project Series episode on Chōgen and the reconstruction of Tōdai-Ji, link in the show notes. Shingon sacred spaces typically have an image of Dainichi or Mahavairochana. If they don't have an image of him, they usually have an image of one of the Jusan Butsu, or the 13 Buddhas. These are the 13 different manifestations and aspects of Mahavairochana. In addition, they sometimes have a miniature treasure tower rendered in gold that sits in front of the monk in between them and the statue of the Buddha. This tower represents the treasure of the Dharma, the treasure of the secrets of Dainichi, and the treasure of everybody's inherent Buddha nature. They will also have a space dedicated to the Goma fire ritual, which we will soon discuss on the show in a bit more detail. Aside from the mandalas, the statues, and the ritual furniture, there are usually images and shrines to lesser gods and kami who are servants of Dainichi, protectors of the sacred space, or historically or mythologically significant figures as well. This is interesting because it shows the inseparable relationship between Japanese Buddhism and Shinto, which we discuss more closely in our Asian religion series on Shinto. One final element I will discuss is the Gorin-to, also known as the Gorin no To, a 5-ringed tower commonly found in Shingon Buddhist sacred spaces. This tower is like a Shingon adaptation of a stupa. The 5 elements of the tower are the top component, which is shaped like a jewel, which represents emptiness. The next level below is like the bottom half of a sphere, and it represents the air or wind element. And then the one below that is pyramid-shaped, and it represents the fire element. The one below that is sphere-shaped, and it represents the water element. The bottommost layer is cube-shaped, and it represents the earth element. These towers are erected in graveyards and cemeteries in Shingon tradition, and like stupas, they are aniconic representations of Dainichi, meaning they are images of Dainichi that don't look like him. Other interpretations about what these components mean also pervade. Per other interpretations, from the top down, the top symbol fuses the shape of a crescent representing wisdom and a triangle representing principle. The crescent of water represents receptivity and is similar to a cup ready to receive the Dharma. The triangle is a point of transition between two worlds, which represents both unification and movement, indicating the activity necessary to reach enlightenment. The circle represents completion or wisdom attainment, and the square at the bottom is a symbol of the 4 elements. Additionally, other interpretations hold, again from the top down, the topmost shape represents perfection, the crescent represents the development of intuition and awareness, the triangle represents the energy created in the pursuit of the Dharma, the circle is the attainment of equanimity, and the square is the basis, the will to attain enlightenment.
How do Shingon spaces differ from other Buddhist sacred spaces?
Specifically, the inclusion of the mandalas, the particular statue programming, and the ritual furniture and implements are unique to Shingon spaces, while other elements are common across other Buddhist sacred spaces. We'll discuss each of these in turn and describe how they are all interrelated in Shingon sacred spaces. The mandalas were introduced to Japan and became part of Shingon Buddhism through the efforts of Kūkai, who we've mentioned a few times on the show. He received instruction on the 2 particular mandalas, namely the Diamond and Womb Realm mandalas, while he was in China, and then he brought those back with him to Japan. The instruction he received on them discussed their form, their relationship, and the way they ought to be used in worship and ritual. Basically, his master Hui Guo explained who all is included in the mandala, what the mandalas represent, and why they're arranged and structured as they are. Then he was instructed on how they are representative of the 2 states of Dainichi's mind and his Dharmakaya. Here is the list of their relationships. First, The womb mandala is the mandala of principle, and the diamond mandala is the mandala of knowledge. Womb is the lotus mandala, and diamond is the vajra mandala. Womb is the form mandala, and diamond is the mind mandala. Womb is innate, and diamond is cultivated. Womb is cause, diamond is effect. Womb is east, diamond is west. Womb is meditation, diamond is knowledge or meditative attainment. Womb is the mandala of lotus thrones, and diamond is the mandala of moon circles. The mandalas are used in meditation, visualization, and in initiation into Shingon Buddhism, so they're very crucial to ritual and practice. Their inclusion in sacred spaces is just as critical. On to the statue programming. Different Buddhist schools have different statue programs that serve different purposes. For an easy example, it's common for Pure Land Buddhist spaces to have an Amida triad. Amida in the middle, Seishi or Mahastamaprapta on his right, and Kanon or Avalokiteshvara on his left. They can be seated if they serve to assist in visualizing them in Amida's Pure Land, or they can be standing when visualizing how they appear to a dying person in what is known as Raigo. The inclusion of these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in this particular arrangement is their statue programming. Shingon statue programming is far more varied, but there are some common themes. Of course, Dainichi, or Mahavajracana, is usually in the center and at the highest position, but like I mentioned, there can be cases where Dainichi is not enshrined, and one of the 13 Buddhas is enshrined instead. Typically, in a hondo, or a main worship hall, there will be a single Buddha enshrined, and then there will be a daishido, or a hall of the master, where Kūkai is enshrined. On these temple complexes, there can also sometimes be a separate hall enshrining another Buddha, such as a fudo-do, or the Fudo-myo-o hall, enshrining Fudo-myo-o. There are a couple of important Shingon spaces with more crowded statue programs that I will discuss in the next question. On to the ritual furnishings. I mentioned before the miniature tower and the Goma ritual platform. There can be more or less ritual furnishing depending on the size and function of a Shingon space, but these and a few other pieces are very common. Elevated the highest, there will be the statue of the Buddha. The next highest will be the miniature tower, and then there will be an elevated seat for the monk to sit, and then below him all his disciples will sit. The space where the monk sits will typically have access to a bell or a bowl to ring, and he will have incense containers that he uses to make offerings to the Buddha and to assist in his visualization and meditation. Then there will be the mandalas on either side. Sometimes at the Goma platform, which usually also has an elevated seat, there will be a statue of Fudo-myo-o, around whom the Goma ritual is centered. This statue is usually placed opposite the viewer, whether that is all of us looking or the monk performing the ritual, so that whoever is involved in the ritual can view Fudo-myo-o in the flames, making his carved or painted features dance in the light so it looks like he's actually present. Finally, there is usually a taiko, or a drum. This is used for keeping time during chanting, such as chanting mantras or chanting the Heart Sutra. While some of these elements are unique to Shingon, some are not. For example, mandalas are used in many other sacred spaces. The diamond and womb realm mandalas are present in Tendai sacred spaces, and there will also sometimes be other mandalas as well. Other sects use different mandalas. For example, Pure Land spaces in Japan will sometimes have an image of the Taima mandala, which is a 2D depiction of Amida's Pure Land, according to the description in the Contemplation Sutra. Zen does not commonly use mandalas that much. However, these sects usually have the elevated seat for the monk, the censers, where the incense is burning, and a drum or some other instrument for chanting and keeping time. These sects also commonly have shrines or images of other important figures, such as Dogen or Eisai, the founders of particular Zen schools, or Saicho for Tendai, or Honen and Shenron for Pure Land Buddhism. They will also have shrines and images of kami. Tendai will also commonly have a copy of the Lotus Sutra to which the practitioners will pay respect.
How are Shingon sacred spaces influenced by texts and doctrines?
When we read and discussed the Vajrasekhara Sutra, the link will be in the show notes, something particularly unique about the text was that it was part sutra, part ritual instructional text. At the end, it deliberately laid out how to use the mandalas, what to do with them, and how and why to transmit the esoteric secrets and keep them secret. As such, the instructional portion of that sutra and of other ones in the Shingon canon are where a lot of the implements we have been discussing come from. You'll remember that the Vajrasekhara Sutra describes the womb realm mandala and how to use it for abhisheka, or initiation rituals. Additionally, some implements come from tradition and interpretation of other doctrines, as in the case of the drum. On one level, the use of a drum in chanting is strictly practical. When dozens or hundreds of people are chanting, you need everybody to be in rhythm, and the drum lets you do that. It's similar to a conductor who directs symphony music. But there's a doctrinal aspect too. We've talked about sound in the context of Shingon Buddhism as being potentially enlightening, and the drum fits in quite nicely with that. When the drum is struck and rings out, especially during chanting, it symbolically represents the Dharma resonating throughout the world. Beating the Dharma drum is a very common metaphor for spreading the teaching, and drumming is commonly understood in that fashion in a ritual context. I mentioned earlier that I would come back to a couple of special sacred spaces with regards to statue programming. The two I will be discussing in terms of their relationship between text and doctrine and furnishing are Kōya-san, the headquarters of Shingon Buddhism, and Toji Kodo, known in English as the Toji Lecture Hall, a unique space designed by Kūkai.
As we go through these, I encourage listeners to look for pictures of these places and statues online.
I agree with that. They're very gorgeous and very interesting to look at. First, Kōya-san. There are two very important towers containing specifically planned statue programs that fuse elements from both the diamond and womb realm mandalas. These towers are known as the Konpon Daito, or the Fundamental Tower, and the Saito, or the West Tower. The Konpon Daito contains a statue of Dainichi in his diamond realm mandala form, surrounded by the icons from the womb realm mandala, namely Amida, Hosho, Ashuku, and Fukujoju. In the Saito, or the Western Tower, the statue program replicates the Diamond Realm Mandala, with Dainichi in his womb realm form in the center, surrounded on four sides by Buddhas from the Diamond Realm Mandala. In this way, the two mandalas are overlaid, or are relationally linked between the two statue programs, which in 3 dimensions and with large statue programs, performs and replicates the doctrine that these two mandalas are two sides of the same coin, and that reality is constituted of both at the same time. In the city of Kyoto, at the temple known as Toji, there's a lecture hall called the Toji Kodo, in which a Dharma master would preach to his disciples. This space, also designed by Kūkai, was meant to emulate the Buddha's preaching to you in Mahavajracana's Pure Land, Mitsugon. The statues are arranged in a mixed fashion between diamond and womb realm form. In the center is Dainichi, surrounded in a circle by the 8 Buddhas that surround him in the womb realm mandala. Then to the sides, there are quintets, as in the diamond realm mandala. The quintet to Dainichi's right is centered on Fudo Myo-o, surrounded by elements of the Dharma rendered in bodhisattva form. And then the quintet to his left is Kongo Haramitsu, surrounded by the same. On the left and right are Taishakuten and Bonten, or Chakra and Brahma from the Hindu pantheons. At the 4 corners are the 4 heavenly kings, Vaishravana, Virudika, Dhritarashtra, and Virupaksha. These 4 are very common inclusions in Mahayana Buddhist temples, as we discussed in Part 2 of the Asian Religion series on Hinduism. Sculptural mandalas like this are ritually and doctrinally very important. On the one hand, they perform and represent the reality and tangibility of the mandalas and the doctrine involved in this world. They are spaces where one can enter into the mandala, according to Cynthia Bogle, quote, with a single glance. When rituals take place, they are meant to serve as living manifestations of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas they depict, and those manifestations are literally present in these rituals. The statue in front of you is not a carbon copy image of Dainichi. It is Dainichi himself, and the same is true of all the other figures in the statue program. In that way, when incense and food is offered to them, when fire is offered to Fudo Myo-o, and when chanting or words of worship are offered to them, they are literally there to receive them, which creates great merit as well as creates more opportunities for your future Buddhahood to be prophesied. Remember that when you quote-unquote enter the mandala, you become a Buddha or a Bodhisattva yourself. You transform from this current form. Thus, the purpose of the sculptural mandala is as a portal to Dainichi's Pure Land, but also as a window into true reality exactly as it is. We've discussed the Buddhist conception of delusion or ignorance as reality paved over, and mandalas, especially sculptural ones, are literal unpaved spots that give us a taste of what reality is really like, free from delusions and ignorance.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion on Shingon Buddhist sacred spaces. Join us next week where we will be discussing lay and monastic Buddhism. Shout out to listener Garrett for asking, what is the difference between a layperson and a monastic in Buddhism? How does this difference entail different duties and roles? How does this difference shift and change over time? We love your comments and engagement, Garrett. Keep them coming. We hope to see you as well as the rest of our audience there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Garrett, and to the rest of our audience, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you like our show and would like to support us, we ask that you instead send that generous support to a worthy cause. Currently, that is easing the weaponized famine that is tearing through Gaza. Because of blockades, charities and aid organizations can't do much. The best we can do is directly donate to GoFundMe campaigns or the like. For now, we're pointing at the page for Tashneem Mahmood, a mother of 3 who has lost her apartment in the bombing. If you are able, please send some support her way.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.